I noticed the moment my future mother-in-law stopped mid-sentence. Not because she was interrupted, not because she forgot what she was saying, but because her husband had just stood up from the dining room table slowly, the way a man stands when his legs have stopped cooperating with the rest of him. He was staring at his phone. Then, at me. Then at his phone again. The word he had just read was still hanging in the air between us. Surgeon. Chief of cardiac surgery. And I was still sitting there holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't been offered, but had gone to the kitchen to pour myself because no one had thought to ask. That moment came much later in the evening. Before it, I was just a woman who had driven 2 hours to make a good impression on a family that had already decided what kind of impression I was likely to make. Daniel had told me about his parents the way people describe furniture they've grown up with. Solid, familiar, unchanged. His father had retired from a sheet metal company after 32 years. His mother ran the parish craft sale every November and made the best butter tarts in Simcoe County, a fact she mentioned within the first 4 minutes of meeting me. They lived in the same house in Barrie, Ontario, where Daniel and his sister had grown up, beige siding, a walkway lined with mums in the fall, a welcome mat that said "Home is where the heart is" in a font that had started to fade. I had been with Daniel for 2 years by then. We met at a farmer's market in Kensington, arguing over the last bunch of heritage carrots. He was buying them for a stew. I was buying them because they were purple, and I found that unreasonably interesting. We compromised. He made the stew. I supplied the wine. That was how it started. He knew I worked at the hospital. He knew I kept long hours. He knew that my phone rang at 3 a.m. sometimes, and that when it did, I had to leave. What he didn't fully understand and what I had never spelled out was exactly what those calls meant. He thought I was a hospitalist, a general physician, in-house at Mount Sinai, someone who rounded on patients and filled out forms and went home tired. I had never corrected him. Not because I was ashamed, not because it was a game, but because the moment you say the words Chief of Cardiac Surgery, everything changes. The way people look at you shifts. The questions change. The silences change. The entire texture of a conversation rearranges itself around a title you didn't ask to become. I had spent 12 years in medicine, 4 of residency, 3 of fellowship, 5 as an attending, and in that time I had learned that the words heart surgeon did something to people. Some became reverent. Some became awkward. Some became competitive in ways they weren't aware of. Very few just stayed themselves. Daniel had stayed himself, and I wanted to protect that for as long as I reasonably could. When he asked me to come to Barrie for Thanksgiving weekend, I said yes without hesitating. His family was important to him. He talked about his parents with the kind of easy affection that told me he'd had a decent childhood, which I'd learned not to take for granted. I wasn't nervous exactly. I was curious. I wanted to see who they were when they thought I was ordinary. We arrived on the Friday evening. The drive up Highway 400 was the kind of October drive that makes you remember why you live in this country. Birches going gold, the sky that particular blue that doesn't last long. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand somewhere around Innisfil. "You're going to love them," he said. "They're uncomplicated people." I smiled and didn't say what I was thinking, which was that no people are uncomplicated. Some just haven't been complicated yet. His mother opened the door before we knocked. She had a towel over her shoulder and flour on her forearm and a smile that was genuinely warm. She hugged Daniel first and then turned to me with outstretched hands. "You must be Claire. We've heard so much." She said it the way people say it when they've heard almost nothing, but mean well. His father appeared behind her, tall, broad through the shoulders, a handshake that was meant to communicate something. He looked me over once, not rudely, just the way people look when they're forming an opinion they've already half formed. "So you're the doctor," he said. "Yes," I said. He nodded, already filing that somewhere. "Good, stable work." Inside the house smelled like roasting turkey and commercial air freshener and something faintly floral that I later identified as a plug-in near the coat closet. Family photos everywhere. Daniel at various ages. His sister's wedding portrait. A school photo of a child I assumed was a niece or nephew. A cross-stitched piece on the wall that said "Bless this mess." No photos of me, no reason there should have been. We sat down in the living room while dinner finished. His mother brought out a cheese plate that had clearly taken some effort, the kind of arrangement you see on Pinterest, but that costs more than it looks. His father turned on the hockey pre-game commentary, and then lowered the volume in a way that suggested he hadn't quite decided whether to turn it off entirely. "So, what kind of doctor?" his father asked. I work at Mount Sinai, I said. Cardiology department. He nodded with the expression of someone who considers that a reasonable answer. Like a cardiologist. Something like that. His mother passed me a cracker with brie on it and asked whether I found Toronto too expensive to live in on a doctor's salary. It was a reasonable question asked in a slightly unreasonable way, with just enough emphasis on a doctor's salary to suggest she was already calibrating where I landed on a grid of acceptability. I told her I managed fine. She smiled and said that rent these days was just criminal, wasn't it? Dinner was called about 20 minutes later. We moved to the dining room. His sister and brother-in-law had arrived while I was in the washroom, and introductions happened quickly. In the hallway, coat still half on. His sister was friendly and direct in the way of people who don't have time for pretense. Her husband was quieter, watchful. We sat down. His mother had made everything herself, the turkey, the stuffing, 2 kinds of potatoes, a green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from scratch. It was a considerable amount of work, and I told her sincerely that it looked beautiful. She accepted the compliment with the slightly dismissive wave of someone who had been making this meal for 30 years and didn't require praise for it, but appreciated it anyway. Daniel says you don't cook much, his father said. I don't have a lot of time for it, I said. Long shifts? Long days. He made a sound that was somewhere between understanding and mild judgment. His wife reached over and refilled my water glass without asking, which I noticed because it was the only time anyone refilled mine without me asking. She did it automatically, without fanfare, and then set the pitcher back down and turned to Daniel's sister to ask about the renovation. That was the first small thing. Over the next 40 minutes, the conversation moved around the table in the way conversations move in families who have known each other forever, references I didn't share, shorthand I couldn't follow, laughter at things that had been funny years ago and had become funny again by repetition. I didn't feel excluded exactly. I felt peripheral, like a passenger on a bus route I hadn't ridden before. At one point, his father turned to Daniel and said that Tom Mackenzie's son had just made partner at his firm downtown. Good kid, worked hard. Then he looked at me. You know what that pays? I said I had a sense of it. He named a number that was, to his knowledge, impressive, and watched me for a reaction. I gave him a pleasant one. He seemed satisfied. His mother asked if Daniel and I had talked about where we'd live if we got married. She said it lightly, but the question was doing something underneath. I said we'd discussed it. She said that Toronto was a wonderful place to visit, and leaned on the word visit just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Daniel laughed in the way he laughed when he was mildly uncomfortable. I'd come to recognize it a half-second too short, a pitch slightly too cheerful. He didn't say anything to redirect the conversation. He reached for more stuffing. I noticed. I noted it. I set it aside. After the main course, his father leaned back and looked at me with the expression of a man preparing to ask a question he considers reasonable. So what exactly do you do all day at the hospital? He said. Is it mostly consultations? Reviewing cases? I took a small sip of water. I operate, I said. He looked mildly surprised. You're a surgeon. Yes. What kind? I looked at him steadily. Cardiac. A pause. So, open heart. That kind of thing. Yes. His mother had stopped serving herself seconds. His sister was watching with an expression I couldn't fully read. Daniel was looking at his plate. Huh, his father said. I thought you said cardiology. Cardiac surgery, I said. It's a subspecialty. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man who is updating information but not yet sure what the update means. And you're what? You're on staff at Mount Sinai. I'm the chief, I said. The fork stopped. Not his fork. His wife's. She was in the middle of reaching for the cranberry sauce, and her hand simply paused, suspended, and then completed the motion in a slightly different way than it had started. Chief of the department? His father said. Chief of cardiac surgery, yes. He looked at Daniel. Daniel was still looking at his plate. Then his father reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed something into it. I watched him read. Read again. Set the phone face down on the table. Then he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as recalibration. Well, he said, I'll be honest. I didn't know that. Most people don't, I said. I don't lead with it. His mother set down her fork quietly. Why not? I thought about how to answer that. Because it tends to become the whole conversation. No one laughed, but his sister smiled slightly. Her husband refilled his own wine glass. The next 20 minutes were unlike the previous 40. Not warmer exactly, more careful. His father asked about my training with a seriousness he hadn't brought to the earlier conversation. His mother offered me more of everything, including the good gravy she'd been reserving for the turkey itself. Daniel finally looked up from his plate. He reached over and touched my hand briefly, just once, a small motion that I couldn't fully interpret in the moment. His father said he'd had a stent procedure 3 years ago. Was that the kind of thing I did? I told him that stenting was typically interventional cardiology, a related but different field, and that I was on the surgical side. He nodded like he was filing a more accurate report than the one he'd been working from all evening. "I'd rather have the facts right," he said. I agreed with him. His mother, setting down the dessert plates, said something that I thought about for a long time after. "You're very young to be the chief of anything." It was meant as a compliment. I think she meant it as a compliment. But it also carried, underneath it, the faint echo of everything that had come before it. The assumption that had governed the first 40 minutes of the evening that I was someone to be placed, assessed, found acceptable or not acceptable on terms that had nothing to do with who I was. "I've been at it a while," I said. She nodded, and her eyes moved to Daniel with an expression I could see but couldn't intercept. After dessert butter tarts, which were genuinely very good, I said so, and meant it. His parents moved to the living room and Daniel and his sister started clearing the table. I helped, because that's what you do. His brother-in-law came into the kitchen with a stack of plates and caught my eye over the dishwasher. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. Asterisk, she called Daniel last month to ask if you were serious about him. She wanted to know if you were the kind of person who would fit. I considered that. And what did Daniel say? He smiled slightly. He said you were the most capable person he'd ever met. "That's not the same as fitting," I said. "No," he said. "It isn't." That night, lying in the guest room with the forced air heat ticking in the walls and the sound of Barrie doing nothing in particular outside the window, I thought about what I'd come here to understand. Not whether they'd like me, I'd known that was secondary. But how they'd treat me when they thought I was the kind of woman who works at a hospital without being the one people call when a heart stops. The answer wasn't cruelty. I want to be clear about that. His parents weren't cruel. They were polite in exactly the way that people are polite when they've decided you are one thing and set about treating you accordingly. The gravy, the refilled water. The question about rent, the conversation that moved around me instead of including me. It wasn't hostility, it was assumption. And assumption, I had learned, is harder to argue with than hostility, because it doesn't know it's doing anything wrong. Daniel knocked on the door around 11. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. "I should have said something," he said. "At the table." "What would you have said?" He thought about it. "I don't know. Something." I looked at him. "You've never said it before either. My title." "I know. Not in 2 years." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you didn't want me to." "I didn't. But I noticed that you didn't." He looked up. "What does that mean?" "I'm still figuring that out. We didn't resolve anything that night. But something had shifted, not broken. Just repositioned. The way furniture looks different after you've moved it an inch." The next morning was a Saturday. Frost on the grass. His mother made eggs and toast and brought coffee to everyone at the table without being asked. She set mine down with a different quality of attention than the previous evening, not performing care but actually paying it. That difference is subtle but not invisible. His father asked if I had to be back in the city for rounds. I told him I had coverage for the weekend. He nodded. "Must be a relief to have people you trust." "It took time," I said. "Building a team you trust always does." He sat with that. "I imagine in your field, trust is a lot on the line." "It's everything," I said. He poured himself more coffee and passed the carafe to me before I asked. It was a small thing. It was also the first time he'd done it unprompted. We spent most of the morning around the house. His mother showed me the garden she'd put to bed for winter, the perennials she'd been adding to for 15 years, the spot where she grew garlic because nobody sells good garlic anymore. I asked her real questions and she gave me real answers, and somewhere in there the conversation became one I was actually part of. His father found me in the living room before lunch while Daniel was upstairs on a work call. He sat down across from me, not with the posture of the night before, that particular straightness of a man conducting an assessment, just sitting. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to take my time." I waited. "Last night, before you told me what you actually do, I had already decided some things about you. About where you fit." He paused. That's not fair to you, and I've been thinking about it since I went to bed. I appreciate that, I said. I'm not asking you to forgive me for it. I'm just telling you it wasn't right. I looked at him for a moment. Can I ask you something? He said yes. If I'd been a general practitioner, or a hospital administrator, would this conversation be happening? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the question answered itself. Probably not, he said finally. That's what I thought. He nodded slowly. I'm not sure what to do with that. Neither am I said. But I think knowing it is the start. He didn't answer. But something in his posture changed. Not shame, he wasn't a man who wore shame easily. Something more useful. Awareness, maybe. The uncomfortable early stage of it. On the drive home Sunday afternoon, Daniel was quiet for the first hour. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the purposeful quiet of someone sorting through things. The highway was clear. The birches were past peak, some already bare. Why did you never tell me? He said eventually. The full thing. I wanted to know you first, I said. Without the title getting there before me. And now? And now I know you. He was quiet again. Then, do you think I would have been different? If I'd known? I considered the question honestly. I think you would have been more careful. And careful isn't always the same as better. He nodded. At the table last night. I should have said something. Yes. I didn't know what you wanted. I wanted you to stand next to me, I said. Not because of my title, because I was there. He didn't answer immediately. But he reached over and held my hand for the rest of the drive without letting go, and that said something. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that follows something clarifying. His mother texted to say she'd found a recipe for the butter tarts and did I want it. She'd never texted me before. I saved the recipe. I haven't made it yet, but I saved it. His father emailed, carefully, in complete sentences to ask the name of the cardiologist I'd mentioned during breakfast, the one who'd written something he'd seen cited in an article he was reading about stent complications. I sent the name. He wrote back to thank me. He signed it with his first name, not Daniel's dad, which is how he'd signed the one birthday card that had come before. That was small. That was also something. There was a moment, about 6 weeks later, when Daniel and I were in my apartment, and he picked up my hospital badge from the counter where I'd dropped it coming through the door. He looked at it for a while, the title, the department, the photo of me that looked nothing like me, because it was taken on a Tuesday in February, and I have never once looked like myself on a Tuesday in February. How does it feel, he said, to wear this every day? Like clothing, I said. He looked up. Seriously. I thought about it. Like something I earned but don't want to become. He set it back down carefully. I think I'm still learning how to stand next to you. I know, I said. I'm still learning how to let you. That was the most honest thing we'd said to each other in weeks, and we both knew it. There was never a dramatic confrontation. No ultimatums, no tearful scenes in the kitchen. Just a series of small conversations that were more difficult than they looked, conducted quietly, between people who were trying to do better than the assumptions they'd inherited. His parents invited us for Christmas. I went. His mother sat me beside her at the table. His father asked for my opinion on something he'd read, not to impress me, just because he was curious what I thought. His sister leaned over before dinner and said, "He talks about you differently now. I don't know what that means yet, but it's different." I said I'd noticed too. It wasn't transformation. It was the beginning of something more gradual and more real. The process of choosing to see people outside the categories you've spent a lifetime using to organize them. I've thought a lot about what that weekend in Barrie actually was. It wasn't a test, I want to be clear about that. I hadn't gone there to expose anyone. I went because Daniel asked me to, because his family mattered to him, because I wanted to know what kind of people he came from. I got the answer. It just wasn't the only answer. And it wasn't the final one. What I learned, what I keep returning to, is something I already knew from surgery but kept forgetting to apply to the rest of life. People show you who they are in the moments that cost them nothing, when no one is watching, when the stakes appear low, when they believe the person in front of them can't do anything for them and can't do anything to them. Those are the moments that count, not the careful ones, not the ones people perform for a room. His father handing me the coffee carafe before I asked for it on a Saturday morning, after 12 hours of reconsideration that mattered. But the 40 minutes before I told them anything, when I was just a woman at the table and nobody had decided yet whether I was worth attending to, that mattered more. The question I came to Barrie with was a simple one. Not will they like me, but who are they when they think I have nothing to offer? The answer wasn't simple, but it was honest. And honesty, it turns out, is a better foundation than most things I've tried to build on. If this story made you think about the way you treat someone before you know their story, or after, I hope you'll sit with that for a while. Most of us, if we're being honest, have been on both sides of that table. The question is what we do once we notice.